Hello, as you all know, my name is RMacDowell. I'm a senior economics major here at Colorado College. Today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the new normalcy of exorbitant CEO compensation in the United States of America. So to begin, it's important to note that CEO pay is at an unprecedented high in today's day and age. Specifically, the CEO to median worker of the same organization pay ratio is up to 204 to 1. Where the average CEO is making more than $13 million annually, whereas the median worker is only making $77,800. And one interesting note is that recently in August of 2015, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, created a new regulation in which companies are now going to be obligated legally to disclose the information of CEO to median worker pay ratio, which hasn't previously been the case, in order to create a more transparent environment where shareholders are more informed and the public are more knowledgeable in terms of what this ratio is, and to try to kind of regulate it that way. So more alarming than the actual gap between CEO to median worker is its evolution over the past few decades. Specifically, in terms of real inflation adjusted dollars, CEO pay has actually increased 997% over the time period from 1978 to 2013. This significant increase dwarfs the growth of the stock market by nearly double, and it's grown much more quickly than the typical wage earner's salary growth, which has only grown at 10.9%. Or not at 10.9%, it's only grown 10.9% since 1978. Finally, the CEO to median worker ratio back in 1965 was actually only 20 to 1, which is over 10 times lower than today's value. If we look at this graphically, we can see very clearly that back in 1965 it was about 20 to 1, and today we're in the 200s. The only differences here in terms of the options realized and options granted pertains to the to whether or not stock options were cashed in that given year. So the next question is, do we care? And the answer is sometimes. As we saw recently, the wage gap issue really dominated the public consciousness after the financial crisis of 2008, as citizens were forced to bail out large banks that were simply too big to fail. Ironically, two fundamentally different political movements were catalyzed here, them being Occupy Wall Street on the far left and the Tea Party on the far right. And so it's really ironic that both of these fundamentally different party movements were created due to the same income inequality concerns, really. And it's important to note that the financial crisis of 2008 was not necessarily pertaining to CEO pay as much as widespread inequality and corruption, depending on who you're asking. But it's very clear that both movements were created by the issue of income inequality, and that the issue truly resonates with people. And finally, after kind of the quelling of both these movements over the recent years, the issue is shifting back in the spotlight now with the candidacy of Senator Bernie Sanders, and it being an election year, so we'll see if it truly resonates again. So the next question that needs to be asked is, how has the market facilitated this rapid growth of CEO pay in recent decades, and subsequently allowed it to get to a level as high as it is today? One explanation an economist might offer is that CEOs aren't actually overpaid per se, but rather they're paid as much as the market specifies for managerial talent at equilibrium. But there are a few problems with this. Firstly, in a competitive market, one's pay should be equal to one's marginal product of labor. And that's really easy to do for a low-level employee at a fast food restaurant, for instance. But when the employee that you're looking at is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, it's a lot harder to do. And this is because it's just virtually impossible, or implausible maybe, to quantify the effect of every individual decision that a CEO makes on the bottom line of a company, when there's so many other factors that go into it. Stock performance, pertains to so many things beyond a CEO's control. So how are you really going to be able to determine a CEO's worth in terms of bettering the company or improving profitability? And then another issue with it is the cronyism that seems to be endemic within the corporate structure, governance structure, in which CEOs are serving on the board of directors of other companies, and inherently determining the market price of CEOs and therefore their own pay. And finally, so my project is going to try to identify the relationship of firm size and performance on CEO pay and see if there is anything tangibly there that can kind of predict the other one. So the methodology of my investigation is actually relatively simple. It's just using an ordinary least squares regression of a few different variables. Firstly, the independent variable is simply CEO pay. This was gathered using the website Equilar's database that has the 100 top paid CEOs of various years. So the most recent 2 years that it had were 2014 and 2013, so those were both used, taking the top 100 from each year. And the dependent variables that will be regressed against are firm performance, like I previously mentioned, which is going to be measured by the percent change in net income or the profits that a company makes from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Firm size being measured by market capitalization, which is the number of outstanding stocks times the market price, and that's also taken at the end of the payment year. And finally, a year dummy, which will try to control for any type of market differences that whether or not the market was performing systematically better in one year or the other, and then a gender dummy to see if there's any effect on the gender of a CEO on the pay. So the first results that we get come from some pretty basic summary statistics. Firstly, just looking at the salaries of the CEOs within the sample, we see that the mean is actually $28.8 million, but it ranges dramatically. Specifically, the highest that we have is David Zaslav of Discovery from 2014, who earned over $156 million. And then the low end of the spectrum is actually Daniel Amos of Aflac, also from 2014, who only earned a measly $17 million as the lowest of the 200 CEOs sampled. So the median is actually $22.9 million, which means that the mean is being pushed up by some of the CEOs at the high end. Looking at the change in net income, we see that the average change is about 51% positive, but it ranges dramatically all the way from decreasing 505% to increasing 2,047%. Finally, looking at market capitalization, we see that the mean is $61 billion, whereas the low is all the way down to $1.2 billion for Tudor Perini, and the high is $270 billion for Tribune Media. Next, moving on to regression analysis, we see that only 2 of the 4 dependent variables are actually statistically significant, those being firm performance in the form of the change in net income and the year dummy, whereas the firm size in terms of market capitalization and the gender dummy were not statistically significant. Firstly, looking at the change in net income, we see that a 1 percentage point change or increase in the net income actually causes a 2.35% decrease in CEO salary, surprisingly. And then in terms of looking at the 2014 year dummy, we see that CEOs during the year 2014, on average, all else held constant, made 10% more in terms of their salaries than in 2013. The final result we see is seen really basically in just a simple table in which only 6% of the CEOs of the 200 are actually females, which is relatively disheartening. So as I previously alluded to, there is a statistically significant impact of firm performance on CEO pay, and we can see it visually here. Looking at the change in the net income, it looks like many of the firms are very much centered around 0, so both positively and negatively. So it looks like the firms are increasing or decreasing their net profitability, either a little negatively or a little positively. But ultimately, we do see that a trend line does generate a negative relationship between the two, suggesting that there is surprisingly a negative relationship between the performance of a firm and how much the CEO of that firm will be paid, which is relatively shocking, but does hold true with the data that I gathered. So a few policy recommendations to kind of counteract this, growing imbalance. The first would be to follow up on the SEC's plan to make the CEO to median worker income ratios more accessible to more effectively allow markets to set prices and allow shareholders to be more informed. Secondly, for there to be more systematic accountability of CEOs, especially when the company underperforms. And finally, to reduce cronyism through increased regulation of the corporate government structure. Thank you all for listening. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all can become CEOs, hopefully before some of my policy recommendations are put into effect. Thank you.